Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
So yeah, I'd like just to tell you a little bit about what the Minnesota chapter of Common Ground USA has been working on over the past several years and share some of what we've learned from working on these projects. We formed our chapter back in 2011 following the CGO conference that was held in Minnesota that year. We just thought it would be a good idea to form a chapter, try and build on the momentum that had been created locally by having CGO there. That conference, you may recall, was co-sponsored by the Humphrey School of Public Policy at the University of Minnesota. And soon after the conference was held, some of their researchers published a study that modeled LVT shifts for the cities of Minneapolis and Richfield and Bloomington, which are first and second ring suburbs of Minneapolis. And after that study came out, we decided to start meeting with public officials and community groups to talk about the study and the idea. And through the course of those meetings, we found that there was actually more interest to be able to do something like that more on like a corridor and neighborhood basis, not necessarily on a citywide basis. So we asked some of these public officials and community groups to send us examples of corridors or neighborhoods they thought could benefit from this, and then we got some funding from our national Common Ground organization to hire a grad student from the Humphrey School to start modeling some of those. We hired someone named Hillary Lovelace, who eventually became one of our chapter members, who was really great to work with, and she modeled over 30 corridors and neighborhoods with the funding that we got. So next slide. This is an example of one of the corridors that she modeled. So this is American Boulevard. It was actually a corridor that's fairly near to where CGO was held that year, if folks remember where you were. So this is a corridor that leads to the Mall of America, a pretty high demand location. And it's kind of a standard analysis. So you'll see there's about $30 million in total property taxes collected in that corridor. So that's for all jurisdictions, city, county, school district, and so on. You can raise that same amount with a 7.9 rate on the $375 million in land value. The bottom left table, we kept getting questions about how many parcels we see increases versus decreases. When Hilly ran these numbers for these 30 corridors, neighborhoods, we really saw a variety of results there. So some corridors saw more increases than decreases, some saw the reverse, some were like kind of evenly split. It really kind of depended on how developed the corridor was. And then this table on the right, back up a little bit. Yeah, this is trying to make the point, as you know, I mean, what happens when you make this shift is you see a lot of change at the extremes. So parcels that have very little or no building value see big increases. Parcels that have a lot of building value see big decreases. The 80% in the middle may see some change, but not as dramatically as on the ends. So next slide. So Hillary also ran the numbers by land use, and obviously land intensive uses see generally increases, building intensive uses see decreases. We had her run it at a 10-to-1 split because we consider that to be kind of a halfway point if cities were trying to phase this in from a 2-to-1 split to a complete land value tax. So it's taxing the land at 7.23% and the building is at 0.723. And next slide. So it's the maps that she did showing the increases and decreases in the corridor. And next slide. We try to pull out examples to show what would happen with some particular parcels. You have the parking lot on the left, paying $92,000 with the conventional property tax, would pay $168 at the 10-to-1 split, $184 at just a straight land value tax, and then the office building on the right seeing really dramatic decreases. So obviously it makes it easier to operate for above average uses and then putting development pressure on the below average uses. So, next slide. So we decided to get some examples for rural towns in Minnesota because the Republicans were controlling the legislature at the time and they still control one of the houses. So this is a town, we weren't able to get the property tax rolls for these towns, but we could get some just broad data and do some kind of basic analyses. So this is a tourist, fairly well-known tourist town in northern Minnesota, and it's collecting $2.3 million in total property taxes. Again, that's for all jurisdictions. So you can raise that same amount with a 4.8% rate on the $48 million in land value. On the next slide. So we have a nursing home on the left, which would go from paying $16,500 currently to $6,400, and the vacant lot going from paying $800 to $1,400.
What's the town again? I can't see it.
It's called Walker, Minnesota. It's up in kind of Lake Country in northern Minnesota. All right, next slide. So the local Sierra Club chapter a few years ago put our bill on their legislative agenda, but they weren't really actively lobbying for it. So when we met with their lobbyist to do something about that, he suggested trying to tie the bill to its clean energy campaigns. And so they wondered what would happen if you did one of these shifts in some of the towns that were closing their coal plants. So we got some more funding from our national organization to hire a student to run some numbers for that. So the next slide just shows the shifts for Oak Park Heights, which is not too far from the Twin Cities, where one of the coal plants are located on the St. Croix River. And the next slide. So it just shows that, you know, if you just tax the land value alone, if the plant was no longer there, under the current system, we'd be paying $58,000, but would pay $162 with the land value tax. So putting development pressure on that site to make reuse of it. So next slide. So this is a summary of the legislation that we had introduced about 3 years ago, and it was drafted by the Minnesota House's research department. There was a researcher there who's been a long-term land value tax fan. He actually learned about it from John Berger, who some of you know. He was active Georgia's, who was also a Minnesota representative back in the 80s. So
ran for governor.
Did he? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay. So Joel Michael and House Research had learned about the idea from him and always liked it. So we had him work on drafting it. He thought it was really important to have cities pass an ordinance to create a district, a land value tax district like this. We thought it could be maybe like a plan, like TIP is done, just the cities adopts a plan, but they thought it was important that it be done as an ordinance. So in the ordinance, the city would have to set out what properties would be in the district, so they could do it with a map, or they could actually identify the particular parcels that would be in the district, and then they had to set out how they would raise the same amount of revenue that's collected on the conventional property tax in that district with a higher rate on the land value. And then the bill has some provisions in terms of when hearings have to be held before the ordinance is passed, and when revised property tax statements have to go out. And then after 15 years, the city has to evaluate the impact on redevelopment investment. So when they originally drafted it, they had to actually sunset after 15 years, similar to TIF. But we went back to them and said, you know, the reasons that you have TIF sunset don't exist here, because we're not depriving any jurisdictions of any revenue. And part of the reason you're doing this is to reduce the incentive to hold out on property. So if you're going to have it sunset in 15 years, people are just going to hold out until after it sunsets. So they redrafted it to have this evaluation done at the 15-year mark. Next slide. So we have an author from the city of Minneapolis and a co-author from the city of Bloomington. His name is Steve Elkins. He's also been a long time LVT fan. He was a Bloomington City Council member at one point and just got elected to the Minnesota House last year, so he was willing to sign on as a co-author. There are 3 rural representatives who have shown some interest in co-authoring. They haven't been willing to take that step quite yet, but we're hoping that they will. As I mentioned, the local Sierra Club has it on its agenda. We have been meeting with the executive directors of the League of Minnesota Cities and the Association for Metro Cities. They've been encouraging, we're hoping to get in front of some of their committees so that they'll consider putting it on their legislative agendas. We haven't had a hearing yet on the bill, but we're hopeful for it this coming session. So any questions about that project? Yeah.
Are you aware that I contracted with the state of Minnesota 20 years ago to do a study? I don't know whatever happened to that. My counterpart was Mark Haveman.
Yeah, we've worked with Mark. Mark is now the director of the Minnesota Center for Fiscal Excellence. Sometimes he weighs in on this and has been supportive, but hasn't really taken an active role, unfortunately, for it. But yeah, I mean, it was a classic study. We still cite to that. Oh, yeah.
And what did the study say?
Well, it modeled some shifts kind of on a county-wide basis. So in Hennepin County, which is the county where Minneapolis is, it modeled some shifts there. And then down in Rochester, where the Mayo Clinic was, they modeled some shifts there. And just really did a comprehensive kind of literature review and was very supportive of the idea. Yeah.
How are you able to determine the value of the land? As far as, foot-wise, yard-wise, or street size?
Well, we're just pulling the data from the property tax records, so the assessors are the ones that determine that.
Do you have any indication?
We won't get this on camera unless we use a mic.
Yeah, we also, you have 9 minutes if you have other stuff to
Oh,
cover.
okay, good. I'll take questions afterward, but we'll move on. Can you, so our next project, this came about a few years ago when we were approached for ideas for increasing land access for beginning farmers. So there's parts of Minnesota where farmland is selling for as much as $10,000 an acre, so it's really posing obviously a barrier for people trying to get into farming. When we were first approached, we shared the information that we had from around the world where land value taxes were used to drive the land into the working farmers and kind of break up these large farmland holdings. But politically, it just wasn't a very feasible thing to try and do in Minnesota. So we began wondering, well, is there something that could be done with a land trust that would help? So we consulted with Paul Justice at the Oregon-Washington chapter of Common Ground and Jeff Smith, both of whom know a lot about land trusts, and we came up with the proposal. If you want to do, here we go. So it would be that farmland would be held by a trust. The land would be held in common for the farmers that would be renting land from the trust. It would be leased to beginning and limited resourced and underserved farmers. They pay full rent for the land, but have title to the improvements and buildings on the land, and they would get a rent credit in equal amount from the rent that was collected, and this would help raise awareness for common approaches to land use. So when we first proposed this, we didn't really get much of a reaction. We thought it was a pretty good idea. About a year after that, we found out about a program where we could get a law student to do a research project for class credits. So we got one of these law students to kind of do some legal research into the idea. And in the course of doing that, she consulted some local experts from some nonprofit farming groups. And they were very encouraging of the idea. They were able to kind of identify some connections that they had in the nonprofit farming community. So we got some more funding from the National Common Ground organization to actually hire Maya again after she graduated to do a second study where she was kind of engaging some of these nonprofit groups on the idea. And the next slide shows part of what came out of that. So the column on the left, the second column from the left, is showing rents per acre for different parts of the state. So this is data that you can get from the University of Minnesota on a yearly basis. And then we modeled it at 5-acre increments. So the annual rent column shows what they would pay for each farm. And there'd be about $20,000 collected in total rent from the farms. We're proposing that 20% of that be used to provide an equal rent credit of $518 to the farmers. This is a hypothetical example. And then the final column shows what their net rent would be at that point. And the next slide shows some expenses that Maya tentatively identified. So we got the cost of a part-time administrator. Right here, this is actually something we got from a presentation that Dan did a few years ago. The idea is to take 20% of the rental fund to acquire more land, because the idea is not to create kind of a cartel, but actually continually expand land access for people. The trust would pay the property taxes on the land, or for the properties. And we found out that even though the idea is to kind of begin the trust with donated land, because people will donate farmland and then write it off on their taxes, there's actually some costs for accepting donated land. So you have to do like title reviews and environmental reviews and things like that. So we had to budget that in too. So next slide. So after Maya's second report came out, we formed a working group with some of these nonprofit farming groups to kind of begin looking into actually putting this into effect. And the first three groups, they showed interest, but eventually decided it wasn't something they wanted to do themselves. The last group, though, the Main Street Project, is still considering doing something like this. They're actually working to train Latino farm workers to kind of start their own poultry operation. So they think this could be something that could actually benefit them in the long run. Next slide. So last project we've been working on, we just started about a year ago. And it was kind of inspired by Martin Adams' book. I don't know if people have read this one, Land, A New Paradigm for a Thriving World. It had an interesting idea in here, which was to, in exchange for city funding to property owners, deed restriction would be placed on the properties, obligating the property to pay land rent in lieu of property taxes, which was kind of an intriguing idea we never heard of before. And it also has some examples where, under this kind of arrangement, the city could actually collect more in revenue from a property than under the conventional property tax, but the homeowner would actually pay less overall than they would under conventional financing. So we thought that was really interesting. We found out of another program the University of Minnesota has where they'll provide a researcher from the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs to do a research project for community groups. So we applied for one of those, got a researcher, and had them look into this idea for the city of St. Paul. And the next slide shows, okay, so there's some land rent options that our proposal has. So we started out with Martin Adams' idea of having a deed restriction put on properties to pay land rent. We're saying land rent is 6% of land value in lieu of property taxes. But then the proposal's kind of been expanded as we've gone along. So the researcher actually suggested, in addition to that, having the city retain title to any properties that it sells. So it's often selling properties that it gets from tax forfeiture, or sometimes like municipal golf courses are closing down that they're selling, or they're taking over development deals and developing it and then selling it. So there's already property the city has, so when they're selling that, they could just retain the land title to sell the building. And then we just added this third option, which we got from this report that came out to the UK Labour Party. I know people saw that one. It's the idea that homeowners could request that when they're buying a home that the city acquire a land title, and then that they would rent the land from the city and just finance the building portion. So we wanted to give the city as many options as possible with this. So next slide. Reasons for doing this: reduce foreclosures. So there's studies that show that homes that are in community land trusts have much lower foreclosure rates because they're not financing the volatile land portion of the property. And of course, it redirects payments for community creative value from the banks and landowners to the community. But not only that, it actually reduces how much public funds are going to landowners. There's a lot of public funds streaming to landowners in the form of section rate housing vouchers and other government programs. And then it mitigates displacement because you're allowing people to purchase homes on an easier basis. And we also have another land rent credit kind of worked into this proposal, which is on the next slide. This is a hypothetical land rent credit. So if 200 homes are in the trust and paying an average of $950 in annual land rent, the trust initially would collect about $190,000 in land rent annually. There would be a 2% annual increase in land rent. So that means in year 10, the trust collects an additional $38,000. So you split that $38,000 between the 200 homeowners, they each get $190 land rent per year, land rent credit. Next slide. So this is some numbers that our researcher ran for us. So the property on the left is just a condominium unit in St. Paul. The one in the middle is a detached home in kind of a lower priced part of St. Paul. And then we have a detached home in a kind of nicer area of St. Paul. And the example on the right shows what Martin Adams was talking about. So you have a property that's paying $5,075 in land rent versus what they would collect under the conventional property tax would be $5,100. So the city's collecting more in revenue under the land rent approach, but the homeowner is still paying less overall than they would under the conventional financing. Next slide. So we've been working with another group called Isaiah. They do congregation-based organizing around community and social justice issues. Some of us in the chapter are also part of that organization, and we got some funding to have Cura do another round of research on that. And we're hoping to have a forum in the fall where we're inviting city council members and city staff and community groups to hear the results of that latest round of research. Next slide. So some things that we've learned from working on these projects is that it's really important to, I think, frame Georgia's reforms as being primarily about land and only secondarily about taxes. If you think about it, back in Henry George's time, the discussion was always about the land question, not the tax question. And we've just found that it's much easier to engage average people on these ideas if you're talking about in terms of land. The second takeaway is that the land value tax isn't the only way you can go about this. You can have public or nonprofit organizations taking title to land, or you can put deed restrictions on the land to pay land rent. And then oddly, we found that when you have these arrangements where people are paying land rent explicitly, it seems to be more palatable to people than talking about in terms of tax. I don't know if it's just because there's an aversion to the whole word or concept of tax, but people actually are more receptive to paying land rent than they are to land value taxes, we've found. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Got quick time for questions?
Well,
Tom's
if we
next,
do
so
Tom,
maybe.
if we do Tom next, and we'll see if we have time at the end for both of them. Where's Tom?
Right here.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
We have a,
You doing the
Dr.
PDF
Slade.
one first, or the?
yeah, the PDF one, presentation one. There we go. There it is, Friday, this past Friday afternoon. My friends Chris, Tom, and Jeff, we go out for happy hour and we celebrate the release of the study that was completed by Portland State University for us. Just this past Friday, the study was completed, we celebrated, and now this is our first presentation on that subject. We contracted, let's go on to the next slide. Contracted with Portland State University, the Northwest Economic Research Center. The reason we did is because it's called NERC. NERC has a very high credibility with the state legislature and with opinion leaders throughout the state. The director is Tom Pichowski. What he says, people listen to. So we figured this was a good bet that this report will actually get some attention from the state legislature, which was our aim to begin with. We had one full-time staff member, Peter, working with us, and 3 graduate economics students assigned to this project. They did very fine work for us. They were very, very cooperative. They did everything we asked them to do. There's one thing that they said, Tom and Peter said to me, he said, well, we produce objective reports. And whatever we come up with, we do not wish for you to change anything. Whatever conclusions we have, please accept those and don't try to change them to make them fit your particular agenda. So we said, okay, we'll do that. We'll be glad to do that. It's your report. So let's go ahead with it. At the end, the last slide, I want you to take a look at the conclusions that they drew. It's not our conclusions. Special thanks, go ahead, next slide, to Robert Schalkendock Foundation, Common Ground USA, and the Oregon Community Foundation for supporting this study. Josie, I'd like for you to accept a copy of the report. Whatever you want to pass it. Where is Josie?
She's
okay.
working at her table.
Oh, well, that's her copy. Oh, wait a minute. That's okay. Let her have this one now, right now. I have 2 others. that I'm going to want to give to Sue Walton as well. So the questions that we wanted to go ahead to another slide. Questions we want to address is, what is the problem with Oregon's property tax? Why is it called a Franken tax? Why is it assailed as the worst property tax system in the country? Is LVT more equitable? What tax shifts occur when we do change to, you're welcome, to LVT? Does LVT incentivize development? Are some landowners overburdened by LVT? And if so, how can we address hardship cases? And there will be hardship cases. Let's go to the next slide. What's the problem with Oregon's system? I'm not sure any of you are familiar with it, but Oregon in the 1990s experienced a tax revolt. The revolt was led by a couple of anti-taxers, Bill Sizemore, Don McIntyre, who placed a measure on the ballot. It had two ballots, but Measure 5 limits the maximum allowable assessment tax rate to $15 per thousand of RMV, real market value. Measure 50 limits the growth in assessments. So what we have now is a system where the tax bills that you receive are not based on true market value, they're based on what's called MAV, maximum assessed value. So over the past 22 years, the gap between the MAV and the true market values has just increased and increased and increased. So our study,
So much a year, is that it?
pardon?
Because they could only raise that.
They can only
so much
raise
a year.
the assessments on each
3%.
property by 3%.
Are those assessed every year or every 20 years? Or?
They try to do it about every 3 to 4 years. They'll inspect properties.
So is that 10% over 3 years or 9% or is it 3%?
3% each year.
Oh, each year?
Yeah.
So it's cumulative?
Yeah,
It's limited to 3% increase per year.
Okay.
but
Yeah.
if property's going up 9% a year,
Right,
right.
you're only
You're still
getting a
three.
third of
You're
the
losing
increase
it,
each
yeah.
year.
Right. So the assessments are way off. They're just ridiculous assessments. Now our study is going to concentrate on this disparity between true market and accessible values and the unequal treatment of taxpayers. The next slide. The disparity between the real market values and taxable values is illustrated in this map, which in fact was produced by NERC at least 3 years ago when they did another study. This study highlighted the inequities of Measure 50, where you can see that in East Portland, the maximum assessed values are closer to true market value. But in inner Northeast, they are far less than true market value. So there have been previous studies that have been done that illustrate this point, the unfairness of Portland or Oregon's property tax system. But we decided, our chapter decided, well, it's time that we come up with a solution. And let's test a solution. So we engaged NERC to do this study and said, because they already did the studies previously, we'll just follow up and say, okay, take the same areas and let's see what a LVT tax would do. Would it increase equitability? Next slide is the first indication of some of the unfairness, not only in terms of the area or location, but also in terms of income. The high MAV to RMV ratios are associated with low income households, as you can see in this drawing. Whereas the higher income are associated with a low difference between or low ratio MAV to RMV. So this is the first indication of the inequitable taxation that NERC came up with in our study. Let's do the next slide. The study model, we have a 3-step model simulation process. The first, we apply current equal rates to MAV assessments. The second, which is the current system that we have. The second, we take the MAV, and we increase them to RMV assessments. We use real market values. What happens now in terms of tax shift going to true market values? The third, we apply an LVT to true market values. This was the study design. We'll examine tax shift in stage 2 and 3 by aggregating parcels by location and land use. Okay, let's take a look at the next slide. The county assessor's office gave us 276,000 properties to deal with. We are concentrated in these 2 neighborhoods. Go ahead and do the next slide. The inner northeast parcel count is over 9,000, 15,000 in the outer southeast. And recall that the inner northeast is a rapidly gentrifying district, centered on the Alberta Street corridor, where the market prognosis is very strong. And the outer southeast is largely a low-income area with single-family homes, more recently multifamily apartments, where many of the households which are being displaced from the inner city are now being relocated. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, the first task is to calculate revenue-neutral county tax rates. First, the county MAV, that's the maximum assessed value, is 67 billion. You can see it on the chart here. The county RMV is 152 billion. You can see how far apart these 2 assessments are. The LVT rates are the same as the RMV. We use RMV, but we split it into 2 rates. So the ratio between MAV and RMV is 39%. The MAV is only 39% of real market value. And in order to reach the revenue neutrality, if you change to real market value, you have to reduce the tax rate from $22.75 to $10 per thousand. A 90% LVT means that 90% of the total rate is on the land, and 10% is on the improvement assessments. This works out to a taxable, or that works out to mean that the land is taxed at 9 times the rate of building. So I think I've heard that this had occurred in Harrisburg. So it's equivalent to that. Well, this is, of course, a model simulation. This is not what's taking place. The revenue under all of these 3 scenarios, of course, is going to be the same, 1.52 billion. So let's go on. Go ahead. If you look at the MAV-RMV ratio, this is an indicator when moving to the current tax, from the current tax to RMV, of a tax shift. As you can imagine, the properties with a high ratio will experience a downward tax shift. Those that have a low ratio of MAV to RMV will experience an upward tax shift. Go ahead. Next slide shows the same, likewise with the land to total value ratio. Is also a fulcrum for tax shift, where the land in Multnomah County, aggregate, comprises 40% of true market value, the total value, which is fairly uniform throughout the Northwest as far as I can tell. With the studies that I've done are fairly consistent, where 40% is about the ratio of the land to total.
That's much higher than most areas, you would say?
I'd say it's higher than some of the areas we've heard about here, but I think it's fairly standard in the Northwest. So properties with a high LTV ratio, land to total value ratio, will experience an upward tax shift, and those with a low will experience a downward shift. So that 40% becomes the fulcrum. Let's take a look at the MAV RMV ratios by community and by land use. The inner Northeast MAV is only 29% of RMV, far below even the average. Why is that? Because of rapid gentrification in the inner Northeast. Whereas the outer Southeast, the MAV is 55%, closer to RMV. So look at the ratios for land use in these two communities. There are much lower in the inner Northeast. You see, every one of them is low, fairly low, indicating a substantial upward tax shift when changing to RMVs. That's in every land use category. Let's go to the next slide, and then we'll take a look at LTV ratio by community and land use. They're similar for both communities. But look at the LTV ratio for the vacant land use class. It's going to be very high, because near 100%, because it's all land. So that's going to indicate an upward tax shift. The outer Southeast is the same. Take a look at the multifamily category. LTV ratio is low, what you'd expect. So let's go to the next slide and look at expected tax shifts. Because the LTV ratio is closely associated with land utilization, we can expect building intensive uses will experience a decrease in tax burden, and land extensive uses will experience an increase in tax burden. Is that what you would expect? You certainly would.
Yeah.
And this is why the planners are very interested in LVT. My profession is planning. I'm the only planner here, I think, in profession, except for, right? So this is what got me hooked in LVT anyway, because it's so consistent with the objectives of urban growth management. Let's go to the next slide. Looking at the county as a total, we see the contrast between two land use classes. You can see the multifamily throughout the county has a ratio of about 24% LTV. Now, land comprising 24% of the total value. Vacant land, on the other hand, is very close to 100%. Let's go on. Now let's look at the results of the simulated tax applications. The first step, going from step 1 to 2, is a shift from the current MAV to a tax on RMV. Now we're not proposing this type of a tax, but in order to study what the effects are separately, you have to look at it this way. So we see a dramatic difference between the two communities. In the inner Northeast, all land uses experience a positive tax shift, just what we expected. That's because, again, it's rapidly gentrifying. Its MAVs are very low compared to true market. In the outer Southeast, there's a negative tax shift, except for the vacant land category. Now this is another indication of shifting back to true market is going to give us a lot more equitability in the tax system if we do that. Go ahead. Next, when we are changing from step 2 to 3, from a shift from RMV to LVT, we see some distinctions. There's a negative tax shift for multifamily properties in both communities. A positive shift in the vacant, just what we expected. No surprise. Well, look at the auto-oriented, where you find more of those in the outer southeast. And the restaurants, both are going to see positive tax shifts because most of these are located in commercial strips. Many of them are underutilized and of very low density, a lot of parking lots and so on. These are strip malls that we're looking at. Strip malls are going to get an increase in taxes under LVT, as we would hope. Okay, go ahead. Here's a graphic illustration of the difference in tax treatment. Look at the contrast in the effective tax rates between current MAV and the LVT in the vacant category. Well, this is interesting because now we see the favorable outcome for the multifamily category. You take a look at that. Quickly, you see where the multifamily is the second category in inner north? Just take a look at this one. You see what happens? Where the effective mill rate is actually lower under LVT than it is under the current market system.
Please explain the colors.
The colors are, the current is blue, the RMV, that is the going to true market value, is the red, and LVT is the green. Okay, and a vacant category, look at the vacant. Look at the tax treatment for vacant land currently. You have vacant land, you got a very low assessment. But under LVT, look at the jump. That's with a 90% LVT. Does that give you an idea of some of the incentives that LVT is creating here? Okay, let's go on to the next slide. 90% LVT also results in a more balanced distribution among household income groups in both communities. This is a contrast with that first slide we saw. Yep, which is below. All right, more equitable in terms of income class as well. Let's go to the next slide. Next we examine whether the LVT incentivizes better land utilization. So we classify all the parcels by utilization status, underutilized and fully utilized, those which aren't underutilized. And then we look later, but we put in a redevelopment scenario where the underutilized parcels now become fully utilized at full development capacity under current zoning. And we'll take a look at the results of that, and they should be quite interesting. Go ahead. This graph shows the effective mill rates under 3 tax schemes on developed and underdeveloped parcels. The results are most graphic in the inner northeast, where the tax increases on underutilized sites. But they are low under the current tax system. Yeah. That makes sense. Similar in the outer southeast, but look at the underutilized properties.
Here's the definition of utilize.
Okay, next.
Sorry.
Am I hearing something? Go ahead. Yeah, okay. We decided to ask NERC if they would do a study or look at the incentive effects of rapidly developing commercial corridors in the inner northeast. Mississippi Avenue, North Williams, anybody familiar with Portland? Yeah, there you go. Martin Luther King Boulevard and Northeast Alberta. Actually, it turns out that they have similar results. So I'll just take a look at Alberta. Go ahead to the next one. Northeast Alberta is the spine of this gentrifying community. First, you can see that the current MAV tax results in a very low tax burden on underutilized sites. And the middle one, you see the extremely low tax. But now look at the results on the redeveloped sites. A high MAV tax and a low LVT tax. Complete reverse of incentives. And a distinctive and positive incentive effects are very clear here. Let's go on with the next one. Okay, an analysis of the shift is summarized in the count of the parcels. There are many more properties that experience positive tax shift in the inner Northeast. There are about a quarter of the single-family parcels in an outer Southeast that also see higher taxes. Now, why? Because outer Southeast was developed as a semi-rural area originally. And it was on they didn't have a sewer system. They were on septic. That means the large lots. The median lot size in outer Southeast is over 9,000 square feet. In the inner city, it's 5,000. So you know what that's going to mean in terms of LVT. So the problems in the outer Southeast, not only lower income, but large lots and small residential buildings. Inner Northeast, their problems are going to be the very large assessment increases that some are going to experience, and some of many are in proximity to new infill, which help to drive up the land values. So let's take a look, next one. We're nearing the end, believe it. Property tax deferrals are already available for disabled and senior citizens in Oregon. But we're thinking, well, let's extend that to those who are asset rich but house poor. That's one possibility. Let's go on to the next. The next possibility for mitigating the unequal or the hardship cases is a graduated split rates, where we start at a very low LTV ratio, maybe 55, 60%, which we did in fact model in this report. And in fact, there is a lower number of properties that will see a positive tax shift if you use the 60% LTV. When you get up to 90%, it's going to be pretty heavy change for many, many residents. Now, third possibility. This is the most complicated. Go ahead. The assessment exemption of improvements. This is the AXI model. Somebody's heard about this before?
CSE.
All right. This was developed by our Georgia's friend in Philadelphia at the Center for the Study of Economics. We asked NERC if they would model this using the AXI model. So what's the AXI model? So we had to explain that, set up some spreadsheets for them, and they went ahead and did it. We chose a building exemption amount that is equivalent to a 60-40 LTV ratio, land total value, or land value tax. That is about 50% of the levy amount that is derived from land values in this case. But you know, in a AXI model, it's a single, a uniform rate for both land and improvements. It's not a split rate. So you have to exempt a certain amount of building value for each property, for all properties. And to do that, we had to, which is about 159 or 160,000 for each property would be exempt. This comes out to a change in the RMV rate, because we have to raise the rate now to make it revenue neutral to $12.62. The median county building value actually is this is about 83% of that. Let's take a look at the result of that. Here are the results are what we might expect. Residential properties, particularly, if you think about it, a person living in a single-family home that's fairly small is going to have a very large effect on the total property tax as compared to a very large building. Yeah. Yes, that's right. But look at the vacant category compared to LVT. Now, there's something strange about this. I'd like to get your opinion on this at some point, but I'm wondering if NERC, I don't know what they did, because they finished this just a few days ago and I haven't had time to really look at their spreadsheets at all. But at any rate, it does come out to what we expect. It helps lower income residents, but it may not have quite the potential for incentives that the LVT does. So that's the study itself. I want to do the conclusions, and I want to end with that. These are NERC's conclusions. These are not ours.
Right.
LVT would do what it's designed to do. Encourage highest and best use of land, provide a more equitable tax structure, incentivize structure upgrading, incentivize development of underutilized sites, discourage land speculation. Hardship cases can be mitigated with carefully crafted legislation. So I'm quite pleased with the result. Yeah.
Yeah, it's important to recognize
Microphone,
that,
please.
Mike, yeah. It's important to recognize that Oregon already had a deferral provision. Because in a lot of places where I've visited and talked with municipalities, we've done simulations and we find that absent a state deferral provision, all those hardship properties have no way of escaping that difficulty. Now, I wonder if there's a possibility, since I think 23 states in the country already have some kind of deferral provision, that we could impose both deferral and permissive land value taxation at the same time.
Permissive.
Permission, allowing localities to do it.
Oh, yeah.
Because you need a permissive in some cases from
Yeah.
the state.
Enabling legislation.
Yeah, well, I
Dillon's
didn't get
rural
into,
states.
yeah, I didn't get into the legislative efforts that we're making, but we are proposing a local option. It's not like Minnesota's, because we believe that the larger the area of coverage for LTV, land value tax, the better it is, because you want to cover an entire market if you can. So we said that a county or a city can adopt LVT on a local option basis, and at the same time be exempt from Measure 5 and 50 limitations. That's the legislation. Yeah. And by the way, we're getting quite a bit of interest in the state legislature on this. Republicans are supporting it. It's bipartisan support for this.
Wow.
We have a study bill that's coming up.
Tom, Brendan, and as a fellow geologist and also as the program director of RSF, I think everybody should know how hard over the many years, I think it's at least 3 years, you and your team and also Paul Justice worked on this project, the tenacity you showed, especially with getting funds to do this. I think everybody should applaud you for your great effort.
Okay, I'm from Oregon, and my major activity is in neighborhood. My major activity is in neighborhood associations.
Button on the bottom here.
Okay. My major activity is in neighborhood associations. This is, of course, a very our top issue, and the Oregon cities are very concerned. One thing to note is that as this laudable reform concept is applied with real statistics, and I'm so glad you did this, another factor enters the picture, both in Minnesota and Oregon, that zoning laws have been totally thrown in upheaval. Oregon looked at the city of Minneapolis prohibiting the limit of to single-family residences on lots anywhere in the city now, not just in the inner core. I lived in Minneapolis once, and apartment buildings, if zoned, could exist next to large single-family homes. Now in the entire city, without regard to where they're placed. In Oregon, over the objections of the city and neighbors, narrowly passed for any city over 25,000, the abolishment of single-family zoning, unless you're the privileged that live in a specific covenanted area. This means the concept of what is the highest and best use is now thrown into question. It may not be next to a transit corridor, that multifamily place. So the reality of gentrification, we are not an underdeveloping area, not Portland. It is accelerating unaffordable housing prices. That inner city area, the gentrifying area, that marks the destruction of affordable housing community for African Americans. They are all forced out, and will, unless they can manage to keep up if they were to keep up the payments. So it plays out quite differently. Portland's home prices are double or triple Minnesota's, Minneapolis's. Yet we copied exactly and rushed through this drastic change in land value. So we must be careful to see the real world impacts. And I can tell you that neighborhood, I got a friend who lives there, you know, when you take and destroy that $300,000 home, which is affordable in Oregon, and replace it with another home, it doesn't house more people necessarily, but it's a double the price. And there are opportunities for speculation driven by the federal income tax, and people migrate to Oregon to drive those prices up to $400,000, $600,000, up to California prices. It has real impacts, and I'm glad that you've researched that, because
Let them respond.
yeah. So this is the issue that drove me to come here and to consider carefully these issues. And I'm so glad that this is on the agenda, because it is our main social problem. The haves and the have-nots. It's all about the $600,000 house, and you cannot build a home, a door, as the builders call it, in an apartment building for less than $200,000, just the construction cost. And yet we'll tear all those down.
Go ahead. It's all right.
Affordability has now become the major issue, certainly in Portland. And they're doing everything they can to help. And that includes changing the zoning ordinance to not allow these monster single-family homes to take the place of smaller, older single-family homes in the same neighborhood.
Tear downs, they're called.
Tear downs, yes. They're trying to eliminate this and put up what they call missing middle housing. Have you heard that term?
No.
Yeah, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes.
They cost $200,000 a door also.
I've got the mic. Okay.
Hey, Rich.
I'm stunned and pleased. One thing I don't know if it was stressed by NERC or if you guys want to stress it, but the shift map or shift chart that you showed of LVT's effect on equalizing low areas by income, the effect of LVT by income, that automatically turns the property tax into a progressive tax. Now, for 50 years, we've been listening to groups like Bob McIntyre's ITEP, who control the zeitgeist, say that the property tax is a regressive tax. This is a very good demonstration that the property tax is a progressive tax if we take the building equation out.
If it's on land, yes.
Yeah. And that would be a big hit with the body politic in Portland, I think.
Many places.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very glad that NERC did this little cross tabulation or a correlation with income classes. Yeah.
Hi, great study and very impressive. You were puzzled by that graphic at the end. I'm wondering if it might simply be the graphic equivalent of a typo, that it's supposed to be all brown and ended up being all green.
I would not be surprised. You know that I was finding problems and errors in the report from the very last minute, literally on Friday afternoon.
Right.
I called up Peter and I said, that figure number 6, what does that mean? And he looks at it and he says, oh, that doesn't make any sense. He changed it. 1 minute later, it was on the website.
Rich, you get up there too. You got questions?
Yeah, I have a question that maybe you could answer, Tom, and maybe other people can. But you referred to a 90% LVT as 90% land and 10% building.
Yeah.
And I've also heard the exact same term, 90% LVT, refer to 90% of the location value of the land independent of the building. And I just, using the same term for two different concepts, and I'm wondering, do we have different terms for those concepts so we know the difference?
Well, I have to confess, when I first learned about LVT from our old friend Eugene Levin in Seattle, where I was living.
Yeah.
He was the one that got me into this. But he didn't, I didn't know about LVT, but he said, we've got to do a split rate. So I thought, okay, in my mind, a split rate means some of it is on land, the rate is on land, some of it is on improvements. So I thought of it in terms of a ratio. And he figured out an algebraic formula to calculate that, which I've been using ever since. But it's not one of those that Stephen Cord had in his book of formulas. It's a different one. But yes, 90-10 means 90% of the rate, total rate, is on land. 10% is on improvements.
Thanks.
Hi, Tom. Bill Askin from Pittsburgh here. I just had a question about the what do you call it, the building improvement rebate. Everybody gets the same amount under that one theory.
The AXI model, yes.
Yeah, the AXI model. Would they give that to people that own vacant land? Or is there some cap on it that it cannot exceed the market value? Because in a way that would subsidize vacant land.
Well, that's the dilemma, because vacant land doesn't have a building. So if it has no building, how can you have an exemption? Is that right?
You can design AXI, and I think you should, so that there's the algebraic function max sum. So if you have an abatement of $100,000 on the property, on the building, and the city awarded abatement or determined abatement is going to be $150,000, you don't get $50,000 back. You max out at your building value. And if there's no building there, you lose.
Right.
In other words,
You get no abatement.
you get no, yeah, you don't enjoy AXI. That's the whole point behind it, really.
Yeah.
So it's done by algebra.
David?
So, yes, my question is to Rich. How did you calculate land rent credit?
In terms of the rent sharing farm trust?
Yeah.
We just took 20% of the rental fund, so the total amount of rent that the trust is collecting, take 20% of that and then split it equally among the farmers. So it turned out to be about $4,000 split 8 ways, gives you about 500.
It's on.
A little bit more detail, but you're collecting, land rent is increase in value of the land?
Dave, speak into the mic.
Sorry, the land rent is increase in the value of the land?
Well, yeah, I mean, if in terms of farmland, it's all based on, you know, productivity, so it won't necessarily increase in value from year to year. The municipal land trust proposal we have would have a 2% increase per year in land rent. We could talk after.
Yeah,
Okay.
sounds good, yeah. Okay, my name is Alan. Thank you very much, Rich and Tom. I think this is really excellent work, very exciting what you're doing. I'd like to ask each of you to paint a picture of the steps forward with the legislature. In other words, what has to take place to implement these two plans. And I'd like you to start with the most pessimistic. If the opponents, what do you anticipate the opponents to do, and then how you can overcome them? A more optimistic scenario where these things become actual law implemented.
Well, if you're talking about our land value tax district bill in the legislature, yeah, I mean, at this point, you know, it's not on really anybody's radar, so I don't really know in terms of opposition what there's going to be. I mean, our hope is that because we've been getting fairly good support from the Democrats who now control the House, that we could pass it through the House. And then even though the Republicans still control the Senate, hopefully some kind of compromise in the conference committee would allow it to go through. It is it's a permissive legislation, so it's not requiring anybody to do anything.
Is there one last question? All right.
You want to know about the Oregon situation? Well, quickly, we had this past session a study bill. We figured that the LVT is not clearly understood in the state of Oregon, especially among the residents, and people need a little bit better education about what it is. So we put up a study bill. It has no fiscal impact, not going to cost anybody anything. So the Legislative Revenue Office has said they have the expertise to do an LVT study. They will do it. We introduced a bill in the Senate, and the Senate, there was no opposition to it. It went through the Finance Committee. It passed and went to the House. It went to the Senate floor. Passed the floor. Went over to the House, and it was in the House Revenue Committee. They had to take up their own House bills first because, you know, the priorities. But it was near the end of the legislative session, and it was about a week and a half to go, and we were pushing and pushing and trying to get the chair to put that bill up in committee for a hearing, and they were about ready to do that. And suddenly, the whole Republican caucus walked out of the state legislature and escaped the state. The leader of that escape threatened to shoot somebody who came to collect him to bring him back to the legislature. By the time that happened, the time had expired and our bill didn't get the hearing. It would have gotten a hearing otherwise, and it would, I think, easily passed the House because there wasn't really no opposition to it. And guess who the sponsor of our bill in the Senate was? Boquist, the one who led the revolt. So this next session, we are going to, the strategy we're going to use is to go to the House side this time, first. And we think we have a good chance. That's just for a study bill. It's a long way to go.